Right. Right. The budget process is a cyclical, and in almost all countries the cycle is annual. Right. Most of the countries, they are preparing budget every year. So therefore, the length of the budget, and the cycle of the budget is 1 year. Every year they are preparing budget. So the process is occurring every year, annually. So there are essentially two ways of characterizing the cycle. The first one, outlining the bureaucratic task. So it's an administrative task, and it does not have much flexible on this, and it's a compulsory, right? There is no flexibility, very administrative, very rigid. So outlining the bureaucratic task associated with the functional stages. So these functional stages comprises of formulation of budget. So drafting the budget. So the drafting consists of several activities, several tasks. There are a lot of processes, cycle. And second one, enactment or approval. So once the budget is drafted by the Minister of Finance, prepared by the government, it is submitted to the Parliament for the approval. Then once the budget approved, now the budget speech, the budget document, enactment, we call budget law. We call it budget law. And number two, then execute. So once it's become a budget law, now the budget is ready to execute. It's ready to allocate fund, and it's ready to collect revenue in the government sector organizations. And at the year end, audit and evaluations. So there should be a scrutiny whether it's kind of monitoring and control procedure, whether the government sector institutes spend or collect money according to their budget, or are there any deviations. So it has the 4 stages: first formulation, second enactment, third execution, and finally audit evaluation. So the second one, right, this is space 1, space 2. Here, genetic logical flow of the stages, model of the policy process. So we call it this one, the first one, the functional stages, second one, generic logical flow of the stages, model of the policy process. So it's proposed by World Bank, of much focus on the first phase. This is what normally followed by many countries, our country. So under this model, there are 2 models here, this one and second one. So now we look at the first one. The first one is called functional stages. Functional stages model. Under this model, the budget process will compressed into 4 broad functional stages. The first one, budget preparation. So we call it formulation. Budget preparation, drafting the budget draft. So it's an internal process within the government. Opposition party doesn't know about this. So internal affairs. According to the government policy, they are preparing budget, they are drafting the budget. Second, the Ministry of Finance, on behalf of the government, Minister of Finance present the budget in the Parliament, and there are many arguments with modifications, with by incorporating the suggestions, then the initial draft will be revised. And third, performance execution, right? Excuse, right? Once it's become approved, the draft budget is approved. Now it's become a budget law that will be ready for execution. It will be implemented in the government sector organization throughout the year. And finally, valuation and reporting. It's kind of a monitoring and controlling mechanism. Let's see the functional stages. It's a graphical representation. So it's start from here. Here, resource projection prepared by Ministry of Finance and approved by the cabinet. So initially, the initial draft on behalf of the government, Minister of Finance takes some policies on behalf of the government, proposes some policies. So based on that policies, the Ministry of Finance have some ideas. So these ideas will be submitted to the cabinet. So in that the Minister of Finance may highlight some macroeconomic targets. For example, economic growth, the GDP through this budget, GDP will be increased by so for example 5% GDP expected growth rate, and export growth rate say 20%, and import restriction will be 10%, and government expenditure will be increases or decrease. So this kind of things. And also he mentioned in present scenario he proposed no new employment opportunities in public sector organization, and the retirement age has been increased, and there are a lot of stuffs, and there's no money allocated for milk import, vehicle import, and there are a lot of restrictions. So these are the initial ideas proposed by the Ministry of Finance and submitted to the cabinet. A cabinet will critically analyze his proposals. Then, hello, Aslam. Right. So once it is critically analyzed by the cabinet, it will be the Minister of Finance will go to the second step. So the second step is budget guidelines and expenditure limits circulated by Ministry of Finance. Right. So here, based on the policy target, so resource projections. Here, resource projection mean what? Where the money comes from, how much money will be available to government to spend. So that kind of projections. So based on this projection, Minister of Finance will circulate how much amount of money will be available for next year spending. So he will put some criterias. And for revenue collecting institutions like Department of Inland Revenue, and he sends some circulars how much you should raise money, you should collect money through the way of income tax and value added tax and customs tax. So there are institutes. So based on his projection, he put some limits, guidelines, right, based on the step 1. He sends some kind of guidelines for expenditure limit, and guidelines for income targets, revenue targets. So that sort of things will be forward communicated by the Minister of Finance to a particular line ministries. And third one, the line agency expenditure proposals prepared and submitted to Ministry of Finance. So based on the guidelines submitted by the Ministry of Finance, line ministries, for example, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Agriculture Export, Ministry of Industry, Ministry of Industry and Commerce. So there are ministries, right? So time to time, the name of the ministry is changed over time, and so the line ministries will prepare uh, their budget proposals. So for example, when we take Ministry of Health, Ministry of Health, so they're preparing. So under the Ministry of Health, there are several departments: Department 1, Department 2, Department 3, and there are many hospitals under the ministry. So they are preparing their own budget. Initially, the guidelines sent by the Ministry of Finance to particular line minister. For example, in case of Ministry of Health, the secretary to the minister receive that guideline, and the Ministry of Health, has been secretary to the Ministry of Health, will distribute the guideline to each institutions, each department under their ministry. So based on that guidelines, they are preparing their own budget, and all the budget from the department institutions will be collected by the particular line minister, and that line ministries will be submitted. Hello? Right? Right? The line agency expenditure proposals prepared and submitted to Ministry of Finance. So according to the guidelines sent by the Ministry of Finance, the line ministries will prepare their own budget. Here, when you look at, there's a box here outside, donor budget meeting for swaps. There are certain ministries, certain departments, they are help from non-government organization. So for example, in as far as we concern Ministry of Health, they are getting money from WHO, World Health Organization, and other donor organizations. Say for example, ICRC, and so somewhere they will get some funding, right? So by incorporating this donor swap meetings, so they are preparing budget, and the Ministry of Finance will collect the line ministry budgets. So for example, here Ministry of Health, like Ministry of Health, there are several several ministries: Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Home Affairs. So there are different types of ministries. So the Ministry of Finance will aggregate their budget, and then the fourth step is the proposals appraised by the Ministry of Finance and negotiation with line agencies. When the departments are preparing budgets, so so sometimes they are unable to totally complies with the government expenditure limits. So their expenditure they can't cut, they can't reduce at all. So that kind of situation, there will be some kind of contradiction between Ministry of Finance and the line ministries, and to reduce that kind of contradictions, there will be a meeting with line ministries and the Ministry of Finance. Here proposals are priced by the Ministry of Finance, and negotiation, there will be a negotiation with line ministries. Here performance evaluation report, inputs and analysis. So in this meeting, so there will be some sort of performance evaluation reports for the previous year, and there are some analysis, right? So based on that documents, so they are will be some negotiation, and there are some adjustment, and the things will be going on there. Aggregating, so it's mean the Ministry of Finance comprises Ministry of Finance compromise the all government stakeholders. Up to this point here, here it's internal affairs inside the government. In the cabinet, all parties are government ruling party, and here the Ministry of Finance sends circulars to the line ministries. So in the line ministries also the government party, and there are some contradictions so between Ministry of Finance and other line ministries. So that sort of things will be sort out within their government. So these are the affairs. Right? Most probably these things, this kind of negotiation will be done at cabinet level. There everything will be sorted out. Now here state budget prepared by the Ministry of Finance, right? By sort out all the issues within the government parties, the Ministry of Finance will be prepare the budget. State budget, sometimes we call what, some master budget, national budget. So right, and then budget approved by the cabinet and submitted to the parliament. Once the Ministry of Finance draft the budget, again it will be submitted to the cabinet. In the cabinet, all members comes from ruling party, the government party. So all the negotiation, all the contradictions, all the policy issues will be resolved, and there are any things to be changed, corrected, will be done at cabinet level. Then here in between, here you can notice IMF negotiation. Before submit the state budget with budget to the cabinet, so there will be a negotiation with the IMF. If any government has a strong relationship or strong dependencies with IMF, so they have to incorporate the IMF suggestions. For example, in the previous government, good governance, they have changed the Inland Revenue Act. They switched to earlier there was I think the Inland Revenue Act was 2006, number 10, or I don't know, right, 26 Act. Then based on the suggestion, based on the comment from IMF, they have revised their Inland Revenue Act in 2017, and this act come to act I think this number 24th of 2017, if my memory is correct. It's 24, I think it is 10, number 10th of 2006. Please check it. If my memory is correct, it is 10, number 10th of 2006. This is number 24th of 2017, Inland Revenue Act. So they have the previous government has changed the act according to their suggestions from IMF. So in that kind of negotiations will be gone after incorporating the negotiation, and they will submit their budget to their cabinet, and there will be some kind of compromises, adjustments within the cabinet level. And here the government donor meeting, actually the amount of expenditure, to meet the amount of expenditure by the government sector, the revenues actually is not enough. So therefore the government depends on some donations. The donations may be come from foreign, for example US aid, and JICA, Japan, and Australian 8, AUS 8, House 8. House 8. So there are donor agencies. These are the government donor government. The right US. It's come from US governments. House 8 come from Australian government. JICA. It's coming from Japanese government. And also locally there are some donors. There are some donors. For example, donors we call that we call Ceylon Tobacco Company. Ceylon Tobacco Company. So Ceylon Tobacco Company giving a large amount of money to the national budget. They are contributing national budget. So when you look at the annual report of CTC, Ceylon Tobacco, they are manufacturing cigarettes. They are contributing a big amount of money to the national budget. So with the plan of the income sources, they are submitting their budget to the parliament. Minister of Finance will submit the budget to the parliament. So here budget appropriation voted by the parliament. There are 3 readings on the budget. So there are a lot of arguments will go on. So at this moment only publics and opposition parties come to know what are the government policies for the next year. So what is the government allocation for the next year? Are there any new job opportunities? Are there any ways? Can we expect any economic growth or inflation, interest rate? That kind of things will be come to know. That is budget appropriations. Budget appropriation mean what? Fund allocation for each department, each organization, each ministries. So there will be a vote, and after voting, the budget speech, the budget document will become as a law, to the budget law. So, and then step 8, budget executed by line agencies. Line agencies mean here once the budget is approved, the Minister of Finance will allocate money to each ministries. For example, money allocation for Ministry of Health, money allocation for Ministry of Education, money allocation for Ministry of Defense. So like that. And the next step is state accounts prepared by Ministry of Finance. State accounts prepared by Ministry of Finance. Now the budget is executed, and finally they have to submit final accounts. So each line ministries, they have their own accountants, chief accountant, and all the accountants will send their final accounts to the Ministry of Finance, and at the Ministry of Finance they aggregate all their reports and they submit a single report. State accounts prepared by the Ministry of Finance. Here there will be annual review of the meeting, and after that, preparation of detailed accounts. So initially Ministry of Finance will prepare the accounts, and the Ministry of Finance should submit their final accounts to the Parliament. Before that, they are preparing audited accounts. Here the state accounts will be audited by Auditor General Department. After the audit, preparation of audited account, then it will be submitted to the Parliament. Approval of audit accounts by the Parliament. So there are COP, Committee on Public Accounts, and COPA, and COP, Committee on Public Enterprise. So this is the stages of national budget. Now we'll see. So this kind of presentation focuses on the budget itself and treats a policy process. It's a policy process that interact as factors outside the cycle. You can notice here. You can notice here. So this is what cycle. So in this cycle you can find, you can understand the this is what the policy process, and this policy process is affected by the external factors. This is one external factor, donor budget meetings external factor, PER input and analytics external factor, IMF negotiation external factor, government donor meeting. These are the external factors. So this kind of presentation focuses on the budget itself and treats the policy processes that interact as factors outside the circle, which impinge the conditions the budget process. It also demonstrates in some detail the bureaucratic process associated with the preparation and enactment, but compresses the implementation process. So it's a rigid process, right? It's a rigid. That's called we call a demonstrate. It's called bureaucratic process. Bureaucratic process. Here they have to do everything on timely manner. So there will be a in the parliament February, November, the Minister of Finance should read the budget every year. So that is at stage 7, no? Stage 7. So before stage 7 there are a lot of process. So all these process under the custody of Ministry of Finance. Ministry of Finance. It's a rigid process. No one can get excuses. If someone delayed the process, every delays will be delayed. So therefore it is not accepted by the government. So that's what it called bureaucratic process. Bureaucratic, very rigid administrative process. Let's see one by one. The first one, the preparation, budget preparation or budget formulation. The budget preparation usually start with an assessment. We start with an assessment by Ministry of Finance, macroeconomic framework. Ministry of Finance, macroeconomic framework for the coming period, at least the coming budget year. Or next 3 years. See, here 3 years budget. Normally in our country there's this kind of mid-term budgets. Normally our country prepares annual budget if medium-term budget framework is in place. So we are this medium-term budget is not applicable for us. Our country normally prepare budget for 1 year, annual budget. So that is step number 1. So this will include the assessment of what? Assessment of first the GDP growth. So when preparing the budget, the Ministry of Finance or the government should keep in their mind what will be the expected growth rate for our country in the next year through the budget implementation. The GDP growth and the growth of domestic revenue and those of external financial flows which support the budget. So from the estimate, when preparing budget, they estimate what is the economic growth, how much domestic revenue will be increases, and what are the external sources of finance. Second, a scope for domestic financing of any deficit. In our country budget, the allocated money spending is very much high. Allocated spending very much high, and the revenue collected by the government is very much low. So always there's a gap between income and expenditure. So this gap is called budget deficit. And how the government's going to uh, fill that deficit, how the government going to fill the gap. First they have to find the domestic source of financing. So especially the CTC, Ceylon Tobacco Company, it's providing big support, strong support to the government. And a non-discretionary spending, which it will have to meet. So that is those inescapable commitments which government cannot vary by policy, such as debt servicing and pension obligations. uh, in the previous classes we have discussed uh, what is the major portion of government expenditure, the students? In the government expenditure structure, what is the major major expenditure? Anyone else from you? What is the main expenditure? What type of expenditure? Yes, exactly. Salaries and wages. Recurrent expenditure, Salaries and expenditure. The second one, what? So it's all together how much? 1/3, no? 1/3. 1/3 will be allocated for salary and expenditures. And the second one is what? Second one, interest payment. Exactly. Good. Very good. Interest payment. Government already received loan from various countries like China and other countries, so they have to pay the interest. So these two expenditures cannot avoid it. Even new government comes to the power, they can't avoid this kind of expenditure. The salary and interest payment, there's no any compromises. Inescapable commitments. Definitely the government should allocate a certain portion of their certain amount of the income to meet this kind of recurrent expenditure. Salary and the pension. Salaries and pension. So what will happen when the government stops pension? At least 90% of the 50% of the our older population will be, we have to lose at least half of the older population will be die, right? They can't tolerate. And so what happened if the government cut the salaries? So it is impossible. So the government, the Minister of Finance, so this kind of expenditure we call non-discretionary spending. This kind of expenditure, interest expenditure and salaries, pension. So non-discretionary spending which it will have to meet, that is those inescapable commitments which government cannot vary by policy, such as debt servicing and pension obligations. Government can say there is no salary increment, there is no salary increases, but they never say there will be a salary cut, salary reduction. Then no way. And the volume of resources that should be held back in contingency reserves. So there are something may happen, say for example like tsunami and flood and landslips, and unexpected one is what? Corona pandemic. So there are this kind of, there are chances to occur this kind of unexpected events. To meet that kind of unexpected challenges, the government should keep a certain amount of money in their pocket, in their treasury. In the treasury, they have to have some amount of money to meet unexpected incidents. The volume of resources that should be held back in the contingency resources. So first they have to allocate money for non-discretionary expenditure, and they have to allocate money for contingency reserves. After subtracting the contingencies and non-discretionary spending, the ministry is able to forecast the resources available for allocation to ministries and other spending departments. Here this is what the total government revenue. First, the government should allocate money to salary and pension, right, and interest payment and contingency reserve. Then very little portion, this portion will be, they have to budget for this portion. So in this within this portion, the government able to allocate to construct bridges, to construct airport, to construct new harbor, to provide new employment opportunities. So whatever the things, they have to spend from this portion, right? So from this money, the government allocate for each ministries and each department and each institutions. And informed analysis of the resources need of various spending agencies. This is usually based on outruns from previous budgets and provisional estimate for ongoing budget exercises. Right, it's an informed analysis of the resources. So it's normally done based on the previous year budget, ongoing exercise. It's a ongoing exercise. It's not a zero based budgeting, it's a incremental budgets kind of. Now we move to the second step. On the basis of macroeconomic forecast, Ministry of Finance will then issue budget guideline paper setting out the basis on which spending department should prepare their budget bids for coming year. So as I told you earlier, based on their projections done by the Ministry of Finance, he will send the guidelines with spending limits. So based on that spending limit, each line ministries will prepare their own budget. So this usually include inclusive ceilings, the top, the maximum, indicative ceiling for each department. Though departments are free to contest these in subsequent budget discussions. So if there are any discriminations, if there are any contradiction, they will be solved in subsequent budget discussions. Ceilings are often based on crude adjustments to the previous year's figures, taking account of the overall change in resources available for allocation. So it's like an incremental budget. So to prepare the budget for 2022, they are taking the figures from 2001, so 2021. They may also take account this stage previous outturns figures or non-policy commitments. So where the medium-term expenditure framework is in place, Ceilings are taken from the second year of previous uh, forecast, adjusted necessary in light of changes in resources available and the experience of budget execution. So this is applicable for medium term budget, for example 3 years budget, 3-year budget. But in our country we have only annual budget. In most cases, however, the main influence is agreed budget for the previous year. In some countries, department may be asked to prepare budget based on high cases and low cases scenario. You may study about flexible budget in management accounting. So in case 100% have capacity, 80% capacity, like that you may prepare a budget. So likewise the government also prepare a budget in some countries. Now we move to step 3. Each spending department and agency prepare budget submission. So based on the guideline, each line ministries prepare budgets and they submit to the Ministry of Finance. That's step number 3. The format for these budget proposals or bids is usually determined by Ministry of Finance in order to ensure that they can be aggregated using common classifiers and budget categories. So there are accounts. In companies there are account code, no. For example, for salary, S1 for mine employee is salary code 2. Salary code, for example, right? In the department, in the government, they have a common structure. Right? For example, S1 salary code 1 or expenditure code 1. So these expenditure codes come from each department 1, department 2, department 3. Then the ministry can get aggregate figure for this expenditure, and this amount will be sent to the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Finance will get for S1 from Ministry 1, Ministry 2, Ministry 3, likewise. So they can get total aggregate budget. It's very easy to them. So they have definite the codes, the columns, the different kind of categories of expenditure. Well, the content of budget format here, budget format varies from country to country. They usually also contain some text setting or some jurisdictions for overall level, the bid and priority expenditure program within it. The Ministry of Finance has the job of seeking to reconcile the bid from individual spending department and overall resource available. So the Ministry of Finance will get from different sources, different departments, and they aggregate the final figure. This may be done by correspondence. No, that's the representative from each department, or there may be provision for specific budget hearing within the Ministry of Finance. So in the ministry there will be a meeting. There's a meeting to hear any contradiction between Ministry of Finance guideline and their department budget. Continuous issue may be taken to the political level to be resolved by ministers. It's an internal issue of the government. Following discussion of the budget bids, the Ministry of Finance put together the overall budget consistent with the sources envelope as revised during the year and submit it to the cabinet. So these provide the basis for cabinet discussion, which may result in further revision. So finally, once the minister aggregate the all budgets figures, they will submit to the cabinet for the further revision. Now we come to the second stage, that is approval. And now It's become enactment. Enactment. There are three words. Enactment. Now it's become, the budget documents become an act, the law, budget law. The budget is then presented and debated in the parliament and then published together with detailed estimates setting out expenditures by department in whatever the detail the procedure prescribes. The formal authority to spend depends on parliament voting for the fund through approval of finance bill. So finance bill means what? It's a budget law. So the budget itself is a act, proposal, budget, so finance bill. Hence the terminology of vote, the specific ceiling for expenditure voted by the parliament. For each expenditure, so some jurisdictions, so for each ministry is a different argument. In our country, also in our parliament, they are fixing the date for the argument on allocation of fund for agriculture ministry. So argument will be made on fund allocation for Ministry of Defense. So every time they have to clarify, every time they have to justify to the parliament. Now the third step is performance, budget performance and execution. Now once the budget speech is voted in the parliament, now it's become a tool to implement the budget. In the budget, they are clearly indicate how much amount of money is allocated for each department, each ministry, each activities, and where the money is going to collect from. And based on that allocation, based on that plan, they are spending the money. Each line ministries will get the money. When the budget appropriations are approved, appropriations mean what? The budget allocations. Resources here, the resources mean what? Fund money. Resources may be released to the spending agencies. Spending agencies mean what? Ministry, each line ministries and the departments and other government institutions. So they are initiating budget execution. The central bank normally hold the government fund within a single treasury account. All the money is maintained by the treasury, single account, sometimes called consolidated account. General fund, known in the Commonwealth countries in consolidated fund. In the Commonwealth countries it is called as consolidated fund. Procedure for release of fund from the general fund to the spending agency's account. So usually held at the delegation of central bank or a commercial bank, differ from country to country. All the money in the treasury. All the money in the treasury, under the custody of treasury, we call it consolidated fund. So based on the budget, approved budget, the finance minister will transfer money from each ministry. For example, here Ministry of Industry. So in the budget they allocated 10 billion for Ministry of Industry and Commerce. Then the finance minister transfer the money account of Ministry of Industry. So likewise, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of class is it? Right. So the only authorized person to transfer money from the treasury to each ministry authority is in the hand of Minister of Finance. So the Minister of Finance use a document to withdraw the money from the treasury to each ministry, each spending agency. It's called warrant. like arrest warrant to release the money. They have warrant, right? So procedure for release of fund from general fund to the spending agency's account usually held at delegation of central bank or commercial bank. It's differ country to country. In many LDC fund, local deposit fund are released in equal installments, either monthly or quarterly. The first release establishes an impress account which is replenished against the submission of account. You may studied about petty cash. In the petty case, impress account, impress. So once the amount is become low or approaches to zero, then the particular ministry secretary can request for additional money, for balance money from the treasury. It's kind of impress system. So not the government, not all the money will be deposited at once. So it's a kind of installment, because the government needs some times, the treasury needs a time to collect revenue and to deposit the treasury, right? So time to time, whenever fund needed, the Ministry Secretary, Chief Accounting Officer will request from the Ministry of Finance. In most Commonwealth countries, the release of fund is controlled by formal warrant, which may specify the line items against which the agency may incur the expenditure. Spending agencies are usually responsible for the disbursement of fund to the suppliers and contractors, following series of steps designed to ensure the procurement procedure are applied and limits set by the parliamentary appropriation. For example, the fund allocated for Ministry of Education, in one department under the Ministry of Education wanted to construct a building. For example, this building cost is 100 million cost. So this 100 million is already allocated by the budget. And this money will be distributed to the contractor or the service provider to construct that building. To offer this work, this contract to the contractor or service provider, they have a specific guideline how they can select contractor, how a particular department can select the contractor, how to call bid, and how to make payment, who is going to approve, who is going to certify, who is going to pay, that kind of things. A lot of stuffs are there, right? So it has a series of steps. So these steps are commitment of funds, right? So already 100 million allocated, so that is committed, fund is committed to that particular building construction. So before allocation of fund, no institutions allowed to call for contract or call for service. So first they have to get fund from the budget, and acquisition of goods and services, then they have to start work, and then after that they have to make payment. So this is the procedure, and finally they have to submit accounts on that works. Now finally, evaluation and reporting. Once on completion of the budget year, the Ministry of Finance or Treasury will prepare final government account. This is step 9. So which are then audited by comptroller and auditor general or equivalent. So normally in our country, auditor general will audit the account prepared by each ministries and each spending agencies, and finally segregated by the Minister of Finance. Again, that will be audited by their Auditor General Department. To ensure independence, the auditor is usually responsible to Parliament rather than to the executives. So Auditor General is responsible not to the Minister of Finance, not to the Cabinet. The Auditor General is directly accountable or answerable to the Parliament. And audit reports are laid before the Parliament and discussed by Public Accounts or Budget Committee. Here, policy process model, right? So as I told you earlier, first one, the functional stages. Number two, the policy process model proposed by the World Bank. First one, the second page. The first one, review policy. Review the previous planning and implementation period. So when they are preparing 2022 budget, they are reviewing 2021 budget. They have to evaluate whether our policy was success, whether our policy is effective, do we need to make any improvement, so what are the shortcomings. So that kind of policy reviews will be done. And second stage, set policy and undertake planning activity. So based on the mistakes, based on the experience obtained from the previous year, again they are set policies and undertake planning activity. So now for example, the government wanted to implement organic agriculture. If the policy is success, they will be continue for the next year. If the policy is not suitable, then they will revise the policy and do the things, and based on the policy they are doing the planning. Establish resource framework, set out objectives, policies, strategies and expenditure priorities. And then second stage, mobilize and allocate resources, right? Based on this budget, based on this plan, the Minister of Finance start to prepare budget, and then implement the budget, collect revenue, release fund, deploy personnel. And then number 5, monitor activities and account for expenditure, and finally evaluate and audit. So policy activities, effectiveness, and feed the results into the future plans. Again, it's become a cycle. Again, these activities will be reviewed, and again set the policy the next year. So it's a cyclical process. That's why it's called cycle, budget cycle. Policy process model. So these presentations are part to assume that the process of policy review and formulation take place in step with budget cycle, which is said to be hardly, right? It's said to be hardly ever feasible in practice. The reasons outlined here. Sustainable areas of consensus on the analysis of budget process. There are substantial areas of consensus in the available literature on the analysis of budget process, including the following points. In order to understand the budget process, it is necessary to understand accompanying process of policy planning. So government first understand the policy planning. And the process of allocation of resources to different institutions and purposes is essentially a political, right? There is no that kind of development of the country. No. The main purpose is what? Political purpose. The government normally prepare budget for the political motives rather than purely technocratic, technocratic one. Any attempt to address content of budget allocation without looking at political process is therefore unlikely to helpful. So if the government prepare budget without political motive, this budget will not helpful to the government to form the government again in the next time. The problem of budget allocation, which means how resources are divided, cannot be abstracted from macroeconomic and revenue issues, which determines the efficiency or effectiveness of the use of fund. A holistic understanding of public expenditure system. Now everybody you understand how the budget is prepared, how the money is allocated to each department, each institutions. Holistic understanding of public expenditure system and institutional cultures that condition them is important in order to formulate strategies for change and improvement. It should be never automatically assumed that allocations translate accurately into spending, right? All the times there's a deviation, budget and actual figures. That's why you studied what variance analysis. So it should be never be automatically assumed that allocations translated accurately into spending. What money actually gets spent by whom, on what items, and for what purposes is often determined during the process of budget execution. Right? Everything will be changed. So there are still, however, some areas of budget process which are heavily contested, notably on how social concerns should be incorporated into macroeconomic policies. Now, a principle of sound budget